You're saying that 2016 is going to be one of the worst years. Why is that?
Well, you know, we've had one bubble after the next crash. 2000 bubble in tech stock, crash. Then we had the 2007 bubble, crash. Stocks went even lower. Every bubble's taken us higher, and every crash has taken us lower. Now we got what I call this final bubble, because it's totally QE. It's totally artificial. It's not the economy causing this like in the past ones. And when this bubble bursts, it's going to be the last to burst, and it's going to take us to even lower lows. So I think, and it's going to happen quickly. Bubbles burst rapidly, as we just saw starting to happen in China. So I think as a year, from beginning to end, it'll be worse than the 70s crash, the 2000 crash, the 2008 crash. It'll be probably as bad as 1931. That was the worst down year for the entire last century. I think it's going to be like that, maybe worse.
Wherever you look, the news is dismal, the prospects at best mediocre. So if you're an investor and you look at all of that, then you don't need much in the way of a provocation to unload, basically out of a kind of panic, because once the unloading starts, in the crazy way stock markets work, they feed on themselves. So the smartest money gets out early in order not to be crushed in the panic that unfolds.
So it can't continue, because it's going to kill the country. So we have a huge problem. It's being hidden. It's not being described and discussed, disclosed. And we're in very bad shape.
There are many signs on the horizon today that a correction much bigger than that of 2009 is on the horizon. The size of the world debt is unbelievably huge.
We're in a giant artificial bubble created by the central banks over the last several decades that's nearing the end. It's at its apogee. I think the world economy is now plunging into an unprecedented deflation, recession, period of shrinkage. That will bring down all the markets around the world that have been vastly overvalued as a result of this massive money printing and liquidity flow into the Wall Street and other financial markets.
I've seen this before a number of times. I've been around a long time. I saw it 69, 74, 79. I could tell you 87. And then 2000 wasn't pretty. And I think a time is coming that might make some of those times look pretty good. You know, I look back and I love this country, but I sure as hell don't love a lot of the politicians in it or the CEOs. I think they've taken advantage of the system, and it's just deja vu. The public, they got screwed in 08. They're going to get screwed again. I think it was Santayana that said, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and I am afraid we're going down that road.
Hi, my name is Jerry Croft. I'm a psych professor at Santa Clara University, and I wrote a book called Implosion: Delusion, Denial, and the Prospect of Collapse. Now, that book is a later version of an earlier book called Duped, which had a similar subtitle. It's about delusions and denial in American public collective life. So, as we start looking at those people that you just heard are hedge fund advisors, former budget directors, professors of economics. I'm a social scientist, a psychologist, and I approach this subject a little bit differently. So here's how we look at whether or not we are deluded or in denial about the state of America's financial health. Okay? I went to two sources. One is Jared Diamond, a noted UCLA anthropologist, wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, but he also wrote a book called Collapse, in which he talks about what makes societies fall, implode, collapse. Arnold Toynbee also is a very noted scholar and historian who's written on the same subject. Now, together, these two guys have kind of identified 7 major factors that bring a society to its knees. Let's take a look at those 7 sisters of the apocalypse. Okay. One is called natural disasters. The Mayan culture is thought to have gone down because of drought. The same is true with the 26 Egyptian dynasties. An empire, it gets overextended. It's gotten too big. The Ottoman Empire has gotten too big, or the Roman Empire is too big, and the Visigoths and Attila the Hun are nibbling away at its perimeters. Another symptom of a declining society is the disintegrating structure of the social organization and the family structure. So that's another identified variable, if you will. Bizarre and perverse entertainment. Think Roman Colosseum. The parasitic elite, some aristocracy or oligarchy, starts sucking the lifeblood out of a society, and then there's a revolution or a collapse. Wrong. The sixth thing is a war, violence, and crime, either war on the outside or insurrection and anarchy on the inside. And the final item is currency collapse and debt. The society borrows too much money, and it implodes for that reason. So those 7 factors have been identified when you talk about ancient Sumeria to the Ottoman Empire and the Roman Empire and Hittite civilization. Let's take a look at this and that'll be our report card for the United States. Let's see how the United States scores on these 7 factors. Okay, that's what I wanted to do in this book, or in a chapter in this book. So let's take a look at natural disasters, for example. In the United States, they have been increasing. We've got wildfires. The total number of acres that are burned in wildfires in the United States is 6.5 times greater than it was 20 years ago. So global warming is having an impact on damages that are created from Katrina all the way to the fires in Southern California. If you look at drought, for example, in 2012, half of all counties in the United States were declared federal disaster areas. All right, so we have had some real issues in the 21st century with natural disasters. So if you tried to quantify this megatrend, the frequency of natural disasters from 1982 up to the present, you can see they are ascending. So that's kind of bad from the point of view of our 7 factors. It's accelerating. The good news is that the total cost of natural disasters in the United States in 2015 was $16 billion. But our economy is a $17 trillion economy. So we're not talking about something that is imminently ready to destroy the United States of America. So I would give us a B plus or an A minus on this factor. Even though it's increasing and accelerating, it is not at the point where it threatens the very foundation of American society. So the second factor is the empire gets overextended. So there's a number of questions. How do we measure this? But let's talk about the United States empire. Most Americans don't believe America is an empire at all, or they don't want it to be. But the other side of that question is that some scholars have said that the United States today has the largest empire ever to have existed on planet Earth. Now, if you look at our military bases in the Middle East, those little yellow stars represent American military bases just in the Middle East. Now, just as a comparison, Russia has 1 overseas military base. Okay? China has none. They're building one in Africa. So Russia and China together represent 1 overseas military base, and the United States has 1,073 by last count. So this is Africa, and these are American military bases in Africa. The United States has military connections with over 130 countries. There are only 192 countries. So our reach is entirely global. So during the Obama administration, the United States was engaged in combat and killing people in 11 different countries: Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, Libya, the Central African Republic, Cameroon, the Philippines, Honduras. All of these countries saw drones or American special forces or American boots on the ground killing people. And the number of people that we killed is not been totaled up yet, but no other country in the world can make a claim that they have been engaged militarily in 11 countries in this century. So that's rather considerable. The American Navy is larger than the next 8 countries combined. The American military Air Force is larger than the next 7 countries combined. Okay, the Pentagon owns 240 golf courses. So the extent of America's military reach is almost unfathomable. So if you looked at world defense spending, that pie chart shows the red is the United States. We spend more on our military than all the other countries in the world combined, at least according to that source. All right? So we don't ask the question, why? Are we the world's policeman? It seems like we are the world's policeman. I wanted to graph that as a factor. How do you graph whether the empire is overextended? I didn't know how to measure that. So I thought I would try to just simply graph the growth of overseas military bases. We had 300 after World War II. A lot of these things have not been disclosed. There are lots of multiple sources that generated this graph, but you can see that it is accelerating and it's going up and up. And when we get it to a tipping point, we don't know, but we can certainly say that this is a major factor in American life. And how we evaluate that, we'll have to see. But it's certain. But the point is, we're not shrinking. The third factor is called disintegration of social structure. Not Caligula, but Sodom and Gomorrah. There's our prototype. So if you look at nuclear families, about 23% of American children are growing up in a nuclear family with a biological father and a biological mother. If you compare that to Japan, 83% of Japanese children are growing up today in 2016 in a nuclear family. So our nuclear families are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. If you were raised in a single-parent family, here are some statistics that are really quite sad, all right? Children who are raised in single-parent families graduate from high school less frequently, suffer more addictions, suffer more abuse, are twice as likely to become alcoholic, 3 times more likely to have a baby out of wedlock, 5 times more likely to commit suicide, 12 times more likely to be incarcerated, 14 times more likely to commit rape, 30 times more likely to be homeless. So raising children in a single-parent family carries social disadvantages that affect society. Now, I tried to graph that, and I wanted to graph that as a factor, a megatrend. Number 3, children born outside of the traditional nuclear family. And you can see that that continues to rise. Between 2010 and 2013, it just shot up another chunk. Men of fatherless households are becoming de rigueur. This is an accelerating negative pathological social trend. Okay, perhaps you see some positives in it. It's a negative factor as as we use the terminology of Arnold Toynbee and Jared Diamond, it's a negative issue for society's health. So the factor 4 is the emergence of perverse and bizarre entertainment. I don't think these gentlemen mean this is a cause of social collapse, but I think it's a symptom of social collapse. That's how they discuss this. The Roman Colosseum and the gladiators, for example, and the applause of the citizens of Rome near its decline. So what do we have here? We have 4 symptoms of this: trash television, reality TV, violent video games, and pornography. By the way, I always thought pornography originated in Scandinavia and Amsterdam, and in doing this research, I realized the largest producer of pornography in the world is the United States of America. There are 242 million pages of pornography on the web, and the United States produces 89% of them. We have the largest market share. So, and it has increased 20-fold since 1999. Let's talk about trash TV. Imagine, here's a guided fantasy. There was a teacher, this is not a guided fantasy, there was a teacher in New Jersey who showed a horror film to his high school class, a film clip from a horror movie. He was fired. There was a teacher who was an actor who had played in a show and in a film, and his students said, "We'd really like to see a film clip." He was in bed with a woman, and his feet were showing, and her feet were showing, and they were covered with covers. Okay? And that's the only, there was no sex, it was just in a bed. He was fired for showing that to his students. A teacher in Mississippi showed a clip of 50 Shades of Grey. They were fired. A sex education teacher showed a movie in Indiana of a very scientific, very dry, educational movie about masturbation to his sex education class. Fired. Clearly, so the school system takes a rather conservative role in the protection of children. Okay? However, before we get to that, I want to imagine a situation, guided fantasy, a 6th grade teacher teaching sex education in junior high school decides that he's going to invite a 13-year-old prostitute to come and talk to his class. And the next day, he's going to invite another girl to come to talk to his class who was paid $500 to have sex. Now, do you think that teacher is going to last very long in that school system? All right. No. The answer is no. All right. However, there's another classroom that kids come home to after school, the classrooms of Jerry Springer, classrooms of Maury Povich, Geraldo Rivera, Ricky Lake of old, even Oprah Winfrey when she got started. There are others. This is called trash TV. So here is a snippet from a 3 o'clock in the afternoon network television program, Maury Povich.
I get paid. What is this?
Will jail turn Joyce around? Michelle's teen terror had sex in a church trying to get pregnant. It gets worse.
Men pay me to have sex.
Will jail change Erica? Tracy's 14-year-old does dangerous things to try to have a baby.
I got paid $500 just to have sex.
So Maury fashions himself as a social worker, okay? That because he brings out these people and then he sends them off to boot camp and he says, "Oh, isn't this terrible?" But he has them dress up, scantily clad, swear into the television camera. He's a circus barker, okay? On afternoon TV, if he was a school teacher, he would have been fired and probably put in prison for child endangerment. But he masquerades as a social worker. Now, Jerry Springer does the same thing, but these guys are abused, exploiting the disadvantaged, exploiting racial minorities. Here comes a little Jerry Springer. These are 2 midgets fighting over a love triangle. Think of this is like going to a circus and watching the bearded lady, these twins joined at the hip. It's degrading and it's a spectacle. Now look at the audience, at the Jerry Springer audience to your lower right. Okay, that's the Roman Colosseum. Okay, between 14 and 20 million people enjoy this kind of degrading entertainment that occurs on a daily basis. Another element of this perverse and bizarre entertainment factor is reality TV. Here's a program. People are paid money to do the most disgusting and degrading things for the enjoyment of the audience. So, for example, in Fear Factor, a person is going to get some money if he successfully allows himself to be covered with snakes, or to eat buffalo testicles, or take a look, to eat live scorpions.
Here we go. Time to beat 7 minutes, 15 seconds. That's it. Go right to it. Look at her. She's a gamer. Yeah. Nice and juicy.
So these spectacles continue with another element, which is called violent video games. So sale of violent video games, especially the access of minors to violent videos that are labeled M for mature, manages to get into the hands of children and preteens, and the majority of children have had access to these things, seen them, and used them, and they involve mayhem, burning people alive. So, how do we quantify this megatrend of perverse and bizarre entertainment? And I thought graphing the sales of violent video games is perhaps the best measure of doing that. And if you notice, from 2005 to 2015, they have increased many-fold, okay, far greater than population increases. You would see the same kind of graph if you did pornography pages produced by the United States. So this is a negative social symptom, according to our authors, our scholars. Factor 5, the cultural elite emerges as a parasitic class. That's another factor that brings down societies. For example, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette lived in opulence in Versailles. They had 15,000 sycophants living near and with them, and the rest of France was starving. Okay, well, that regime came to an end, and Marie Antoinette was decapitated. Similarly, in Russia, the Tsars, the Romanov dynasty, had palaces and had their Easter eggs made of gold. The personal wealth of the Romanov family was estimated at $300 billion at the time they were overthrown. But the per capita income in Russia at the time of the revolution in 1990 was about $1,500 per year. That's kind of a big discrepancy between the top 1% or the top tenth of 1% or the top oligarchic family. So these are factors that bring civilizations to their knees. Now, what about the United States? How are we scoring on that factor in our report card? Well, the number of millionaires in the United States increased 20% in the last 5 years. There are 425 American billionaires in 2012. That increased tenfold since 1987. Has your salary increased tenfold since 1987? Forbes says since 1980, the net worth of America's richest class increased sevenfold. So the income inequality is expanding and expanding and expanding. Bernie Sanders, another socialist like Lenin, but not exactly, he has something to say on this subject.
Something profoundly wrong in our country when the top 1/10 of 1%, not 1%, 1/10 of 1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. That is immoral. That is wrong. There is something profoundly wrong when we have seen in recent years a proliferation of millionaires and billionaires, while at the same time millions of Americans, folks here in New Hampshire, Vermont, are working 2 or 3 jobs, and we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth. That is wrong, that is unacceptable, and together we're going to change that.
So I wanted to graph this as our 5th megatrend, the cultural elite, the parasitic class. So this is the proportion of wealth controlled by the top 1%. And you can see that it has almost reached the level of the Great Depression. Now notice that in Japan, the top 1% controls 10%. In France, the top 1% controls 10%. So our system has changed from the 10% all the way up to 23.5% right now. So this is a factor that causes societies to collapse. So there's another one. It's called factor 6, internal or external violence. Now we don't have a lot of external violence on our shores. We've had 9/11. Okay, but nothing that has threatened the very foundations of American society. But internal violence is also included in this factor. So if you look at crime, for example, I was surprised by these statistics. The United States has more sociopaths than any other country in the world. I mean, the number of crimes committed in the United States are basically twice that of the next countries. Okay? We have twice as much crime as Germany or Britain, and much more than France, Japan, India. Per capita, the robbery rate in the United States is 179 times greater than it is in Japan. There are more rapes in the United States than in any developed country. The highest number of incarcerated prisoners in the world, 3 times more prisoners per capita than Cuba, 7 times more than Germany. Death from firearms in the United States is 14 times more than Ireland, 250 times more than Japan. Well, they don't allow firearms easily accessible in Japan. So you would think that this is a very, very negative indictment of American society. But if you look at violent crime, which is what these gentlemen were talking about, violent crime in the United States has actually declined. Now, believe it or not, I don't know, maybe we locked them all up. There are many, many theories for why this is happening. But violent crime has declined. It's declined 20-some% in the last 5 years. And since 1990, look at that. That is the best news we've come across. We're getting an A on this factor because it's in decline. Except, well, it should be an A-, because if you start in 1960 and you look at 2015, it's still an uptrend. Okay, let me graph it for you this way. It's an uptrend. But recently, it's in a downtrend. So this is positive news. Of our 7 factors, this one is a pretty good one. So we're going to give ourselves a B+ or an A- on this. Now, the final factor is short-term interests predominate over long-term interests, and debt is incurred. People are like Veruca Salt in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. They say, I want it now, even if I don't have the money to pay for it. I'll put it on my credit card. I'll borrow against my home equity. I want it now. I want that new car. I want that college education. I want that vacation in the Caribbean. And let's go and have fun. So when we start looking at debt, that's where things get really, really serious. We thought Obama was going to change George Bush had a war in Iraq, and when you go to war, you increase taxes. George Bush did not. He lowered taxes when he went off to war in Iraq. If everybody in the United States had to pay for the war in Iraq, it would cost the average American family $20,000. Do you think we would have gone to war in Iraq if your tax bill went up $20,000? Not likely. That's probably why it went on a credit card. So the national debt has reached close to $19 trillion. That's not the only source of debt. There's a thing called the trade deficit. We have we have purchased $6 trillion more of goods from the outside world than we have sold to it. So we have been, as a deficit nation, for years, since the Kennedy administration, except for 1 year with Bill Clinton. And so that's not true of Germany. It's not true of Japan. That represents over $1 billion a day that we are accumulating that kind of debt. So that's a second source of debt. But there are others. For household debt, take a look at that blue line. That's the amount of credit card home equity debt that households have taken on over time, and that's projected through 2016, 2019. The red line is savings. Savings is declining, debt is increasing. Everywhere you look, we are following this path of saying we want it now, even though we don't have enough money to pay for it. Student loan debt is now $1.2 trillion. Now, there is a thing, here's a piece on the debt picture.
How far in debt is the U.S. government? Let's put the numbers in perspective. If we stacked up individual $100 bills, $100 million would look like this. If we added up the annual incomes of everyone in the top 1%, they would total about $2 trillion. That's 20,000 pallets of $100 million each. This is the total value of all assets the U.S. government currently owns, about $3 trillion. In 2015, the federal government collected $3.2 trillion in taxes and spent $3.8 trillion. The government had to borrow the difference, which brought its total debt at the end of 2015 to $19 trillion. For comparison, the annual output of the whole U.S. economy is only $18 trillion. But there's more. In addition to its debt, the government owes what are called unfunded obligations. These are future Social Security and Medicare payments that the government has promised to retirees, but which it does not have the money to pay. The present value of unfunded obligations is about $70 trillion. That means that the total amount of money the U.S. government either owes or has promised and cannot pay is almost $90 trillion. That figure is nearly 40% higher than it was just 5 years ago. And it's about $10 trillion more than the annual economic output of the entire planet.
So I wanted to try to quantify this, and I didn't want to include unfunded promissory obligations, just actual existing debt. It's called total public debt, and that is a summary of mortgage debt, household debt, city debt, county debt, state debt, federal government debt. And that is $60 trillion as we speak. But if you look at the growth of that, there is another megatrend. This has got to be a D- or a F+, because it is accelerating way beyond population growth. So this is another factor that brings societies to the brink. All right. So what I wanted to do is ask the question, are we getting close to a breaking point? What is a tipping point? When does this explode? When does this bubble burst? When is it going to happen? Is it going to happen? Our report card is not good. Okay? We have one of the 7 factors that is in decline, and every one of our other 7 factors is accelerating. Okay, so let's review what those factors are. Natural disasters, empire overextended, disintegrating family, bizarre and perverse entertainment, parasitic elite, the 1%, war, violence, and crime, that's the one that we can take to the bank, and the debt. All of those things push us towards social collapse. So I wanted to quantify all 7 of these factors and put it into a single measure, a single metric. And I teach research methods at my university, but I asked a statistician, Dr. Bruce Enger, to help me and to scale these megatrends into one single factor. And I thought, let's call that the American Dystopia Index. Okay, so we mathematically combined all of these measures into one measure and graphed it. Now that yellow line represents those factors, those 7 factors summarized in one single line. You'll notice, and the green line is population. So you'll notice that our dystopia factors have been hugging population till about 1995. We were healthy until that time. And then things got out of hand. Debt, the cultural elite, trash television, okay, natural disasters. All of those things add up, and they increased 3 times faster than population, 5 times faster than population, and that's where they stand right as I speak today. Now, how do you interpret that? Let's say this was the medical chart of a single individual, okay? And the green line represents healthy, baseline, normal stuff. And the yellow line represents all of the negative risk factors. This man is overweight. He smokes a pack and a half of cigarettes a day. He drinks a fifth of whiskey a day. He doesn't exercise. All of the 7 medical indices that would measure his health are totally out of whack. Okay, so for him to bring his yellow line down to the green line means he would have to lose 80 pounds, he would have to stop smoking, he would have to completely stop drinking, he would have to start exercising, he would have to eat differently and stop eating junk foods. Okay? He would have a major... People have done it, haven't they? They have done it. But would you invest in that person? Would you put your life savings, your 401k, down and say, that person is going to be alive 5 years from now? I'm a long-term investor. I will invest my 401k in the fact that that guy will be alive 10 years from today. Would you do that? So but what we're looking at is collective risk factors. These are social indices of dysfunctionality. And it looks like our chart is really out of whack. Now, how do you bring that yellow line down? Well, you would have to cut our overseas military bases by half. Do you know anybody who wants to do that? You would have to put Maury Povich and Jerry Springer in prison and and eliminate internet pornography and stop violent video games. I mean, Luxembourg does not allow it. Iceland does not allow it. In Greece, you cannot buy toys for shooting people. Okay, the same with Sweden. We don't have any such resolve in this country to eliminate these kind of negative influences that affect children. The cultural elite, how do we bring that yellow line down? We would probably have to tax them in such a way that they would only control 10% of the national wealth instead of 23%. We would cut their equity in half, okay, to bring this yellow line down. And on the top of that, we have to do something about the disintegrating family. 23%, 27% of Americans are in nuclear families. How do you increase nuclear families and decrease single mothers raising children? Well, you can enforce laws which require fathers to pay for the children that they have fathered. You can engage in mandated divorce counseling. There are things you can do. How are you going to deal with debt? I mean, $60 trillion in debt, we have to, if we wanted to bring this yellow line down, we have to cut our debt probably in half. That is a very serious matter. No one is proposing any of these changes. So you're investing your money in this patient, okay? You're investing your 401k that this patient is going to be alive 5 years from now or 10 years from now. So in summary, this report card is not good. I don't know if the depression is coming in 2016, 2018, 2020. Okay, I'm not that kind of a prognosticator, but the risk is incredibly high. And the answer to the question, is America on the brink, I think is answered, yes, it is. Thanks for watching.